This video is intended for entertainment and historical purposes only. It's not meant to be an instructional tutorial or provide professional advice.
Here's a ponderous fantasy of fire and steel, the mighty forge of a modern Vulcan. All locomotives are overhauled periodically. Each one, after going from 120,000 to 400,000 miles, is sent to the shop for a complete overhauling.
In the old days, the practice of lifting a locomotive off its wheels was a common part of locomotive maintenance. Railroads had massive workshops full of armies of well-trained men who could accomplish this task in a matter of hours. Today, I'm going to do this exact same thing, just on a much smaller scale. But regardless of the size, the parts involved and the tools used are all identical to that of a big mainline steam locomotive. The one big difference between how I'm doing this today and how it would normally be done is I don't have the luxury of a 5-foot deep pit to stand in. But that's okay, because there's a benefit to this that I'll tell you about in a couple minutes. With the boiler out of the way and one crossmember missing, I'm actually able to squeeze in between the frame rails quite easily. But don't ask me how I'm going to do this on locomotive number 2. That's going to be a nightmare. The first task is to separate the binders from the frame. To do this, we need to remove the nuts on the 2 binder studs. Fingers crossed none of the binder bolts break in the process. The wedge bolts are here just to adjust the wedges up and down, so we won't have to fiddle with them right now. Once we get everything torn apart, I'll go over all the individual parts that make up the frame and give you a brief description of what they do. But for the time being, when I refer to the pedestals, I'm talking about the vertical legs of the frame that are on either side of the driving boxes and main driving axles. The pedestal binders are not actually part of the frame. They're only there to tie together the jaws of the pedestals and provide a rigid stiffener for the frame itself. This rigidity doesn't come from the binder bolts, but actually comes from a male and female taper machined into the bottom of the frame pedestals and the top of the binder. Once we get the binder nuts off, the binders are still going to be securely attached to the frames. This is because of that male and female taper I mentioned. This requires a whole nother procedure to actually remove the binders themselves. The binder nuts are only there to tighten the binders into the taper and then hold everything in place. To actually separate the binders from the frame, we need very specialized tools, in the form of steel wedges and a big hammer. These wedges have a very gentle taper to them, and they were designed specifically for the job of releasing binders from the pedestals. As simple as they are, these are the actual tools meant to do the job, and without them, removing the binders is an absolute nightmare. The procedure is incredibly simple. You use 2 wedges, one on either side of each taper on the bottom of the pedestals. You tap one in, then tap the other in, and slowly the tapers release and the binder will drop to the ground. Where it becomes a little bit more complicated with this particular locomotive is in the case of the wedge bolts. The wedge bolts are threaded directly through the binder itself. So when the binder is lowering, it's actually pulling the wedge down with it. On larger locomotives, there's sometimes a bracket bolted to the bottom of the binder in which the wedge bolt goes through and then uses 2 nuts, one on top of the bracket and one below the bracket, to adjust the wedge bolt up and down. And the hole in the binder that the wedge goes through is a little bit larger, so you can drop the binder and the wedge bolt will stay in place with the wedge. So because the wedges are quite sticky and tight on this engine and rusted, it becomes more complicated getting them to release and getting the binder itself to release. But it's very simple, and it just takes a little bit of patience back and forth, and eventually they all come out. As I told you earlier, normally when you're doing this, you're standing in a maintenance pit, and the binder is right at about eye level. So you've got a big 20-pound sledgehammer, and you're whacking these wedges, 6 inches from your face. I was always taught, and this is a little hack from the old timers, to either put a rag around the wedge or dip the wedge in some grease and then rub it in sand before you do this. If you don't do that, the metal on metal contact between the wedge, the binder, and the frame itself is slippery, and the wedge will tend to come out, fly out, hit you in the face, whatever. Whereas if you use the rag or the grease with the sand, that adds another medium that will secure the wedge in there a little bit better, and you have less chance of hitting yourself in the face with the wedge. Now that I have you totally confused because I'm using a wedge to release a binder that's pulling a wedge, and there's wedges all over the place, some I'm hitting, some I want to release, let me back up a minute and explain things. So there's the wedge that I'm using, the tool, but then there's also the pedestal wedge. You can see all 4 of them here with their associated binders and their wedge bolts. I'll go over in detail a little later exactly how they work and what they do, but I just wanted to clear up the confusion. There's the wedge, the tool, and the wedge, the component. With the binders dropped and the wedges out of the way, the frame is essentially ready to pick off the axles. There's nothing rigidly holding it in place other than gravity. Now, if we go back to the second video when I removed the boiler from the frame, I mentioned how the front end is so heavy and it wants to tip forward. This has come back with a vengeance, because now that the number 2 binders on the second axle are removed, there is nothing to stop the frame from going as far forward as it wants. You can see that clearly here. There's a massive gap above the driving boxes on the number 2 axle, whereas there's no gap on the number 1 axle, and the driving boxes are tight to the spring saddle. For the lift, I rigged everything up in such a way that no added stress would be placed on the frame. Now, this is always a concern when you have the binders disconnected, because the frame becomes much weaker at those points. The heaviest part of this entire assembly is obviously the cylinder casting, but it's also the strongest part. So chains were added in front of the casting, and then I used a block of wood about midway back of the frame and chained at that point. This will make for a very level lift and shouldn't put any undue stress on the frame itself. In a perfect world, the frame should lift straight off the axles, no sweat. Of course, this isn't a perfect world, and this locomotive has been through a lot, so this isn't what happened. Due to years of corrosion, the driving boxes on the number 1 axle were a little bit reluctant to release from the pedestals, so they wanted to lift up with the frame. This was easily rectified by lifting very gently on the frame itself with the wheels, maybe an inch or 3/4 of an inch up in the air, and using a block of wood and a large hammer to persuade them to let go. With the frame released from the driving boxes, we can now position it in another area of the yard and continue the process of disassembly. With the frame removed, we have the opportunity to take a very unique look at the driver sets. There are side rods still connected. You can see all 4 driving boxes are still on the axles, and if you look closely at the number 1 axle, you can see the pedestal shoes still firmly attached to the driving boxes. These are what was causing the frame to stick during the lift. For the moment, I'm going to leave the driving boxes on the axles and the side rods applied. Moving over to the frame, it's now torn down to its base components. All that's left is the frame, spring rigging, and cylinder assembly. Initially, we were planning to move this entire assembly into the shop in one piece, but now we're starting to think that perhaps we'll remove the cylinder casting from the frame itself. This will give us the ability to mount the entire cylinder casting in the milling machine when it comes time for repairs. With the wheels out of the way, you can clearly see the pedestal jaws that I've been talking about all video. The shoes and wedges mount to the pedestal jaws, and then the driving boxes ride up and down between the shoes and wedges. The rear pedestals are tapered, and they match a corresponding taper on the back of the wedges. The front pedestals are vertical, straight up and down. This is where the shoes are mounted. The shoes and wedges have two main purposes. One, they're a wearable surface that can be replaced, rather than wearing the frame or the driving boxes. And second, the wedges, being adjustable with that taper and the wedge bolt, allows you to take up space as the shoes and wedges wear. If you've ever heard a locomotive knocking as it goes down the tracks, sometimes that's the driving box moving back and forth. In that situation, you would use the wedge bolt to adjust the wedge, tightening up the space between the wedge and the driving box. It's generally not advisable to store a locomotive frame with no wheels under it for any length of time without the binders applied. The frame rails may look big and heavy, but without the binders applied, they could actually be very easily bent or damaged. From this angle, you can clearly see the tapers on either side of the binders and at the bottom of the pedestals. Out of sheer curiosity, I decided we'd pull the steam chest covers and steam chest lids off and have a look inside, see what condition the valves and valve faces are in. To be frank, I'm a little concerned about what I'm going to find once the lid comes off. This thing's been sitting a very long time, and I assume it's either going to be totally full of sand, totally full of rust, or a combination of the two. Either way, not good. To say I'm shocked by how considerably good it actually looks inside the chest would be an understatement. Now, I was partially right. There's a lot of sand in there. It looks like the steam ports and the exhaust ports are pretty much full to the brim of Nevada sand. But all in all, it looks a heck of a lot better than I expected. The other pleasant surprise is the gasket is still in place and actually looks pretty good. Now, I call this a gasket, but really it's heavy-duty copper round stock that's formed into a square and soldered together at one end. It's annealed each time it's taken apart and gets reused over and over again. While we're playing around, I decided we might as well pull one of the cylinder heads off. The left side was the obvious choice because I know from the crosshead placement the piston will be in the full back position, giving us the most amount of space for sand, small creatures, rust, and who knows whatever else to accumulate in the cylinder bore. Unlike the steam chest lid, the cylinder heads have conventional gaskets. I'm not going to say what material they're made out of, but I'll leave it to your imagination. They also have a machined collar that fits inside the bore, about 3/4 of an inch. This makes for a very tight fit. Between rust accumulating on the studs, the collar basically welding itself through corrosion to the inside of the bore, and the gasket basically acting like glue to hold the cylinder head to the cylinder, this became a bit of a challenging process to get this piece off. Again, this is just one of those things that takes patience, a big hammer, a chisel, a little tapping, and eventually it'll come loose. Once again, I'm totally blown away by the condition I find the cylinder in. It's got a little bit of accumulated rust and junk, but for the most part, it's quite clean, and there's no scoring or any damage of any sort. Honestly, the condition of this cylinder is really a best case scenario. I couldn't have asked for any more than this. The next thing we need to remove is the front coupler pocket, or drawbar pocket in this circumstance. I say that because this engine was designed for link and pin couplers, not knuckle couplers like what you'd see on a modern locomotive. The link and pin system is exactly how it sounds. Basically, you have a big link. It looks like a single chain link that fits into the pocket, and then a pin drops through and holds it in place. Each rail car has a similar pocket that the link goes into, and another pin drops into place on the car. That's how the engine pulls things around. The link and pin system is very dangerous, and it was outlawed in the 19th century by all the big railroads. However, industrial operations continued to use it right up to the end of steam, and in some parts of the world, it's still used to this day. In an industrial application where, say you have a Dinky like this one, and it's hooked up to 8 gravel cars, you're not disconnecting it very often. Generally, those cars are hooked up for the duration of whatever task the engine is there to perform. Where it gets dangerous is when you're coupling and uncoupling to cars repeatedly. That gives more opportunity for somebody to get hurt using the system. Ironically, both engines have their front drawbar pockets, but they're both missing the rear drawbar pockets. Don't ask me how that happened. So we'll use this casting as a template and make a wooden pattern to have 2 more pockets cast up. Thanks for watching right to the very end. The next video will be released the first Friday of next month. And if you haven't already, why don't you go back and watch the first 3 videos in the series Restoring the Davenports. Thanks a lot.